Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our Inspire the Mind series of chats. And I might look a bit odd, but I couldn't resist sitting in the sunshine. It's a lovely afternoon. And my guest this afternoon is Chris Cherry, and I'm really excited to chat to him because he is particularly interested in the mental health of healthcare professionals, we could say. We were just chatting briefly earlier. He started with doctors and now he's extended to thinking about the psychological health of nurses. So welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us on Inspire the Mind.
Pleasure.
Great. So just to kind of give us a bit of context, just start a little bit about you, where you are, where you are based, where you grew up. Just put a little bit of context about how you got involved in the world.
Yeah, I was thinking about it before we came on air. I mean, first of all, I'm a qualified registered psychotherapist with a practice in Paddington.
Mm-hmm. Been
practicing for about 30 years, which continues to amaze me. 30 years has passed so quickly.
Wow.
But over those 30 years, I've done a lot of different work in different areas of mental, emotional health. The important part of what I'm doing now, and mainly the reason we're talking, is giving some attention to the mental emotional well-being of not just doctors but nurses or practitioners within the medical environment, private or public.
And before we come back onto that, can we just kind of a little bit more about you? I mean, how did you get into this work? Did it come straight after school, university? What was the sort of was it something in your background or growing up that sort of led to it?
I mean, it's interesting how far, I think as we get older, we realize how our historical context becomes ever more important in terms of understanding our identity and sense of self. So my parents, lower middle class, working class in Durham, they got married. Their parents never talked to each other. It had that kind of, they were born in early mid-30s. So there's kind of interesting kind of class issues in the background, but they were inspirational, but in quite a modest way. So when they were born in the early 30s, mid-30s, so they started to have some influence in the world in the 60s.
What did they do?
So it was very, very modest. They were youth workers.
Right.
My father became a community center leader. His real interest was working with adolescents, young people, and without really kind of.
I don't call that modest myself, but yeah.
Well, modest in the sense it was part of that wave of the 60s into the 70s.
Yes.
When there was a lot of optimism and belief in youth centers and resources. Yes. It was kind of just seen as. Now it's questioned, or the way it's provided, it's very different. But then it was very much part of society.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Was it part of the sort of wave generally of optimism in the 60s that we could sort of sort things out? Or
I think so. That's why they were inspirational. It wasn't. It seemed very, what they were doing, they did very easily, but it seemed very positive.
Okay.
So, there wasn't, I mean, obviously I wasn't, this was when I was a child, but there was no sense of any tension in the work that they were doing, that they would bring back. If anything, they brought in, I remember my mother, she read The Spare Rib in the 70s, which was very
feminist,
kind of very feminist, very radical, very small group of, she had that, and she used to do sexual identity with a group of young women. Kind of very, in some ways, kind of ordinary stuff now, but then it was quite out there, really. But it was always very positive.
That's interesting. So in a way, you had a context of making a difference to others, discussing psychological well-being. You this territory was familiar to you, as it were.
Without even really thinking about it. It was just the environment in which I was brought up in.
How nice. I wish I'd had more of that kind of. My parents were fantastic in many ways, but quite sort of keep calm and carry on, quite buttoned up, not very chatty on these sorts of topics, really. I don't think I ever discussed sex, for example, with my mum.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, no, not with my mother, but I only ever spoke to my father once about sex, which was, what was it? Have you got condoms? You know, so I mean, it's quite, now everything has got its own sort of complexities. So on the one hand, very idealistic, in other ways, very conservative,
Yeah.
very traditional.
Yeah, if you can't be good, be careful, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's funny. But just before I want to talk more about you, but when you say it's different now, do you think it's different now, the kind of approach to young people generally, or just that the problems are much worse and it's made it more complicated, or, you know, that we're in a kind of era of, I don't know, you know, pornography, rape culture, toxic masculinity, that feels like the issues are much worse or more difficult now?
I mean, I went into working with young people. That was the beginning of my kind of therapeutic work. It was working with young people in Hackney.
Okay.
I mean, that was in the early 90s. But the young adolescents that I work with now, in a way, they're much more articulate,
Right,
about emotional experiences. They haven't necessarily lived a life yet, but they've got a vocabulary to talk about their emotional experiences and their childhoods, and there feels like a much more stronger commitment to the process of therapy, like
right.
a genuine interest and curiosity about themselves, in a way that before it was, I mean, everybody comes because there's some form of crisis, but within that, I've seen much more, and I want to use this to find out a bit more about who I am.
But that feels good, no?
No, I think
that kind of similarity and the sort of taking it seriously. You know, this and also I suppose what I like about that, because I'm sure you know, one keeps reading that, is it half of all mental health conditions start before somebody is 14? I mean, I know these sort of things are bandied around, but the general point being that a lot of things start quite young. So if we can get to young people, and also there's something quite optimistic that, so the therapist I work with, and by the way, you know, I salute you as a psychotherapist, because, you know, it's just made such a difference to my life, really unbelievable. Having had really severe depression myself, I just, I mean, and I mean, the woman that I'm working with has just really changed my life so much. But one of the things she says is that actually sometimes with young people, you know, outcomes can be quite good and quite swift because they haven't necessarily had these patterns for very long. So, you know, if you get sort of negative thinking or catastrophizing or whatever it is, you know, so I'm 56. I've been doing this stuff for a very long time.
Yeah. I mean, one thing just to say about your therapist, and very important for people who are listening, it's just the importance of the relationship. I mean, you have a real sense of trust and connection and sense of value, all the therapeutic parts of a relationship you have with your therapist. And that's key, I think.
Yeah, because they say the modality doesn't matter, you know, it's about this relationship. But
it really doesn't.
But drilling down on that relationship, I mean, I'm just trying to think what, as you say, it is really, it's a lot to do with trust, isn't it? And it's to feel there is some sense at which you feel that the person kind of cares, you know, that they and that they like you.
Yeah.
I think
that and the way that they engage with you in terms of the issues. I mean, most people come in and feel, you know, most people say that they're being self-indulgent, or
right,
I must be boring, or you must be so frustrated with me.
Right.
And I think as a therapist, there's something important about, you know, that's part of the negative conversation we have with ourselves that a therapist can sort of bring people out of, and go back into looking at what it is that they're feeling frustrated by and so forth. I think that's
quite right. It sort of starts right there in that very first conversation, doesn't it? That, you know, that they're somehow this kind of lack of worthiness, that they're not good enough to have, you know, that they don't deserve this kind of focus or attention.
Yeah.
But just going back, so you're brought up in Durham. Do you go to university in London, or
No, so I go to Sussex University.
Okay, studying psychology, or
well, psychology, a mixture of things, including film studies. This was the 80s.
Okay.
So it was kind of an eclectic range, which actually, I studied the Western and film noir, which is absolutely perfect in terms of sort of imagery and psychological kind of themes.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any data on this, but I absolutely love all those very dark Scandi box sets.
Yeah.
I always feel after watching them that I'm so lucky. And, I know there's a lot of work around appreciation and gratitude and but when I watch that very dark stuff, I think, gosh, well, I'm not having to deal with drug dealers, or I'm not being bundled up in the back of a Volvo or something,
Yes. I just started watching Spiral.
Oh, it's brilliant. Yeah.
It is brilliant, but I'm into the third series, and actually I'm realizing it doesn't make so compelling, but actually it leaves quite a dark, maybe it's my age now, but it leaves quite a dark mood. It's relentless in its...
Yeah, I do find, and sometimes the violence is definitely too much. I mean, I do quite a lot of sort of putting my hands up like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose it's that kind of visual that a visual imprint is so strong.
Yeah, but it's the power of the medium.
Yeah,
And one of the things about therapy that, it's kind of understanding the complexity of us all as individuals and some of the simplicity of things that we need recognizing or acknowledging.
Yeah.
Like someone saying something positive to us, it really does have an impact on us, and in the same way it's negative.
I'm very struck by that, actually, because I often think that I don't know what you think about this, is that sometimes when one thinks of the reasons for problems, and sometimes those reasons are really hard to sort of unpack or unpick, and maybe it's not even helpful. It may be that, as you say, sometimes the answers are really surprisingly simple, but the problems are complex and the reasons for the problems are complex, but the answers can be quite straightforward.
Yeah. And with young people, just to return to that as a theme, I'm also, they have such a vocabulary to talk about emotional issues or experiences, and quite dramatic ones. I mean, everybody talks to some degree or other about PTSD or ADHD or ADD, or, we're all familiar with that language and sort of labels. But I think it's also important with younger people not to define them with what they're going through in that moment, because there's so much still to come into being. That's
such a good point. Yeah, they're forming identities, and it's not fully formed. I read an interesting thing about one of the issues with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, actually, what's behind, having just said maybe the reasons for problems are not as, not necessarily helpful to go too much into them, but there was an interesting thing about this idea that with young people, the work of people like Erik Erikson, and individuation, which is basically this idea that through adolescence you're kind of creating this identity. And one of the challenges of social media is that people don't necessarily know their identity. Exactly as you say, we've got to be careful of over labeling, over pigeonholing at such a young age.
Yeah.
But what social media can do is it can sort of, it's almost like a smorgasbord. Like, okay, here's an identity. You could have this identity, and they're very strong identities. So sometimes with, for example, self-harm or eating disorders, and I'm a bit out of my sort of, I'm not a psychotherapist, but there's this idea that you can sort of almost, pick an identity, and then, through the internet, and, identity sorted, but it may or may not truly reflect you. I thought that was kind of quite an interesting way of thinking of why social media can be so frightening.
Yes, yeah. I mean, again, like anything, it's both very valuable resource and build communities, but it inflames particular versions of ourselves at a particular time and doesn't necessarily take into account context. It's all kind of noise, really, and of course, younger people are attracted to.
What do you mean, context versus noise? What does that mean?
their own situation. So, for example, eating disorders,
Yeah.
roughly, and this again is something very, in terms of younger people, is quite a big thing that I'm interested in, is about autism and neurodiversity. And a
Yeah.
lot of young girls who have eating disorders tend to be on the spectrum.
Yeah.
And even what I just said there is very simplistic, but
Yeah.
beginning to understand more about some young people's vulnerability to mental health problems or emotional well-being issues.
I think that's thought to be quite a topic with gender identity as well, isn't it? The neurodiversity.
Yeah.
There's quite an overlap between sort of autism and people questioning their gender identity.
And young women on the spectrum, neurodiverse, is hugely underreported.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think is much more visible through mental health issues. That's where it becomes visible, because a lot of the other stuff is quite masked.
So and why is it underreported?
Well, I think it's because girls, I mean, again, we can get into issues around gender and you know, how we adapt to the environments we're in, but broadly, girls kind of watch and integrate themselves into belonging, being part of something, whereas boys are more individualistic, more kind of kind of going outwards, whereas young women, girls, are more inward.
Maybe there's, I mean, it's probably very simplistic. That feels like there's a bit of an evolutionary, you know, the young man setting off with his spear on his own, the women, you know, gathering their berries together around the pot, as it were.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the young men that I work with now, again, are much more keen and believing in the importance of their own emotional health.
Right.
Wasn't there before. So, like anything, there's lots of different moving parts to how we're making sense of things, and social media has been good in some ways and bad in others.
Sure. So you left Sussex and you set up your practice pretty much straight away, or you trained first and then?
No, I went into children's homes in inner cities, which took me then to the youth counselling service. Then I trained as an integrative psychotherapist.
Okay.
In my late 20s, early 30s.
What does that mean, integrative?
Yes, I mean it's essentially being given. You spend a bit of time on a number of different modalities.
Right.
Whether it's Freud, Jung, into the Carl Rogers, the humanistics,
the
mindfulness, and you bring your own, what you consider the strengths of all of those kind of ways of working into one practice.
Pick a mix.
Pick a mix.
Nice. I like that. I noticed that in my own work, that sometimes people get very messianic about different answers, you know, often with quite good intention. So I've written a bit about the links between mood and food, and the nutritional world get very, very excited that that's the answer. And then I've done bits of work around mindfulness, and the mindfulness practitioners get incredibly excited about mindfulness. And actually I work a lot with mental health charities. So I'm an ambassador for SANE and Rethink Mental Illness. And when I'm running workshops, I sort of more and more feel that it's so bespoke. You know, people can pick different approaches at different times that may be helpful.
Yes. And different life events, you know, whether it's problems in a relationship or one's own internal emotional health or aging. Sure.
Good. So we've got you set up your practice. You're an integrative psychotherapist.
Yes.
And you're already beginning to focus on young people, or that was how you started?
That's how I started. Then I moved into a more general practice, but I also set up. I was trying to remember what it was called, because it was someone else who'd set up the London Men's Centre.
Okay, interesting.
We very specifically targeted, aimed at men, whether it was men's groups, workshops, one-to-one work, just a space for men who wanted to. At the time, again, this is in the 90s, that was seen as quite kind of radical.
Sure. There's that kind of idea that you know, men aren't very good at being vulnerable. You know, women aren't very good at being angry. But just so, what's amazing, you've had such a long career, and as you say, you've already helped, you've very interesting sort of not imagining, but just sort of how things have changed over that 30-year span. You're talking about the eloquence and fluency of young people talking about issues.
Yeah.
What other things have you noticed have sort of changed over that career?
Well, I think a little bit that you were just sort of pointing out, which is more sort of tribes, more groups with their own kind of cultures, their own kind of work pressures. I mean, the corporate world is way ahead in many ways than the NHS in attending to people's mental health, emotional well-being. It's much more integrated into those environments, but also environments like the army. There's a moral duty of care within the army, so everybody has access to a therapist or a counsellor, which isn't the case in the NHS in quite the same way.
But maybe this is all a good thing because the NHS can't really cope. So maybe it's great that this is being sort of, the need is being picked up, in the private sector effectively.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think the NHS, the time is now to look at this within the NHS, within the medical environments, to push back against some of the structures and struggles for a number of different reasons to kind of provide good quality kind of services, resources for people, not just after they're struggling, but proactively.
Right.
Like you were saying earlier, the different ways that we can attend and care for our emotional well-being so that we minimize our vulnerability to more serious mental health problems.
And what do you think about the fact that the NHS offering is basically cognitive behavioral therapy and, like it or lump it?
I mean, I think it's kind of got a shape to it on paper. It's very easy to explain. It's kind of got its sort of timeline of what you do and what you fill out and feedback, and you can put the data into, you can crunch the numbers. So it's got its usefulness, I think. And one of the things is that each therapy has its moment in the sun.
Right.
And because people believe it in that moment, that itself creates positive energy. I've heard CBT really good. So you're already investing in the belief that it's good. So that's a significant part in itself, that you are investing in something that you believe will have a positive impact on you. But Carl Rogers was Rogerian therapy, or who was it that wrote? John Cleese wrote that book. Who was it with? Do you remember John Cleese wrote a book on?
Yeah, so like families and how to survive them.
Yeah, exactly, which was hugely popular at the time. I can't remember what model that was with. It was with that therapist. But there's a moment in the sun for a particular modality or view of how to attend to our emotional health. I think CBT is in that moment, is the model at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, has been for good, 15 years, I'd say.
Yeah, well, and now it's integrated into, it's much more formalized. It's part of the resources. Yeah. But EMDR is gradually becoming.
Yes, I've been. That's so interesting. Yeah, because I've been hearing from quite a couple of like patients and psychologists that it's being used a lot for trauma. Just tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe even just like how you perceive cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, I suppose I would say that it's not about circumstances, it's how you respond to circumstances in a nutshell, but maybe you've got a better way of summing it up.
You mean in terms of what CBT can offer?
Well, I'm interested in what both are offering, just for listeners who maybe are not so versed in psychotherapy.
I mean, CBT, I think another reason why I think it's popular is it's short term. Yeah. And you follow a path, you follow a therapeutic path that's generic as well as specific to you as an individual.
Right.
There's a pathway for you to follow to break down what you see the triggers are, to understand what your body's doing, fight, flight, frozen. It stays at very kind of accessible understanding of something. And if you're doing that in a short period of time for 10 weeks, you would hope that it would have some impact on your understanding the longer term, I don't know where it doesn't in a way address the sort of deeper, in some ways more interesting issues about
Right.
our individual psyches. It doesn't really go into that, but that's not what it's really
Yeah.
designed to do. It's sort of,
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't go into childhood or
yeah.
those sorts
I
of
mean,
things.
it'll touch on it, but it's not about sitting, not about processing the memories or particular things that have come up.
Yeah. Because I
As you,
mean, it is quite controversial. I mean, so some of the sort of psychological, is it, I can't remember the name of it, but there's the psychological body, the BA something, whatever, I can't remember what it's called, but it's, you know, they've challenged it as, you know, that it doesn't, you know, they say it probably works for half of the people that do it, which isn't actually that high.
well, I mean, I've always thought everything is a third. So a
Oh, like
third,
antidepressants.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, a third of people will be hugely affected by CBT. A third, it will be of use, won't be life-changing. It will maybe potentially rebalance things.
Yeah.
And for a third, it's a complete waste of time.
That's fascinating. So why do you think it is a third, a third, a third?
I don't know. I don't know. But
Yeah, I tend to agree.
I don't know whether it's just how we're hardwired.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but every modality seems to come. Well, once it's gone into its maturity,
Right.
and the excitement has worn off, then I think you begin to see
Yeah, that's
where it
fascinating.
tends to level off, I think.
And tell me about the EMDR. So that's I don't know much about it.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'm not. I haven't done anything on EMDR. Just anecdotally from clients and some of my colleagues who've retrained. They're
Right.
very. I mean, they are, you know, very passionate about it. And
And
I refer,
what does it stand for exactly?
it's eye movement.
Eye
Uh,
movement desensitization
that's
or
it.
something, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I wouldn't really be able to tell you in the kind of the clinical detail that's kind of needed to really explain it,
Yeah.
it is about a very deep excavation of your own history,
Yeah.
uh,
I know.
usually around a traumatic event.
Yeah, I know that, for example, it's particularly good for things like trauma around bullying.
Yeah, yeah, or
Um,
early childhood abuse of one form or another, and
yeah.
anything that was either in its own right traumatic or over a period of time traumatic.
And
Uh,
how has it been for you of sort of 30 years of hearing other people's traumas? Because that in itself, I know therapists have supervision but I mean, that in itself is quite traumatizing, maybe.
um, I mean, people ask me that. There have been times that I've struggled to be able to kind of have my own separateness as I listen. It's very important not for people's stories to wash you away, overwhelm you,
Right,
and,
right.
or you're just surviving them, you're just bearing them. And at the same time, people come with uh, very deep depressions, very
Yeah,
disabling anxieties. So you've kind of got to meet people. That's for me, I think it's about being creative. If the times that I think I need a break is when I'm losing my creativity.
right.
Because for me, it's a kind of collaborative conversation where we're engaging both with what someone's experiencing, feeling emotionally, but also processing it, reflecting on it, understanding it more as to why we go into reactions in the way that we do,
Right.
and what happens. And if you keep the positive tension on that, then to me that's the healthy relationship with clients as a therapist.
So that's nicely described, that it's, as you say, it's a kind of combination of the in the moment feeling, and that the person can bring that and share it and allow it, and maybe be re-allow a strong emotion from another time, but it's not overwhelming because there's that reflection and there's this kind of stepping back. So it's almost like yeah, I mean, people talk in writing, so I'm a journalist by background at the
Yeah,
time, so
yeah,
you know, you have a kind of a narrow focus, and then you have a you know, you sort of you pan the camera out, as it were. So it's almost, I don't know if that's a sort of image that's maybe helpful.
I mean, I think it's about engaging with someone who's depressed, who by the very nature of depression doesn't see the world in a good way. The world is not good. And how you hold that and remain not unrealistically optimistic or engaged or looking for the opportunities, that's part of, I think, the role of a therapist is to hold on to the possibilities out of something that's very debilitating emotionally, mentally, without it becoming a kind of, oh, everything will be all right kind of.
Do you think it's true that someone who's in great distress or mental anguish, that there's a sort of idea of allowing those feelings, and that, you know, what we resist persists? So there's somehow you have to kind of almost go into it more.
In a positive way, you mean?
Well, I just the sort of whole idea that, you know, we kind of resist feeling fully, we shut feelings down, and that maybe therapy is a place, it's a kind of safe place where you can sort of experience even those very dark things, but you can experience them in a very collaborative almost way. You're not actually on your own.
No, I think there is an importance in being able to feel liberated in expressing yourself. I think, I suppose there's a difference. One of the things that I'm very kind of attentive to is how we react to whatever's triggered us, what our reaction to that trigger is. And that, to me, usually it will be a kind of negative belief about oneself, or an acting out, or a fight flight, which takes you further away from what you were originally feeling, whether it was fear or need or want. And I kind of trust that, because when we're sort of struggling with our mental and emotional health, we're in conflict with ourselves in some ways. You know, there is a negative narrative going on in the experience, as well as just feeling awful or struggling in different ways. But if we start to kind of reframe it as the value of knowing what's at the core of it, understanding what's at the core of it, I think the emotions flow quite naturally.
So for example, if you feel very threatened, naturally you're going to be fearful. That you're not, i.e. you're, you know, Freud had that phrase, didn't he? Ordinary human unhappiness. That these are understandable. You know, people have very difficult issues in their lives, and you know, maybe even in that in itself is helpful. That, you know, they're not odd, they're not abnormal, they don't necessarily have a mental health issue. They're just reacting, you know, as sort of almost as you might expect. But do you think that? Sorry, go on.
No, I was just to add to it. I think there's a kind of an importance of normalizing why we will respond or react in the way that we're doing. Once we understand why we're doing it for all the different reasons, then I think we can change our relationship. Not why wouldn't you feel that way? And then beginning to kind of embrace or take care of that part of you that feels so bad or negative.
It's a sort of self-care, those sorts of ideas, sort of self-compassion.
Which is kind of some of what you've done in you know, one of the books, what was it, Walking in Sunshine?
Walking on Sunshine.
On Sunshine.
No, that's very cool. I didn't know you knew about them. Oh, thank you.
But, you know, in there it's just very clear, you know, it's got a simplicity about it, but it's kind of got its caring encouragement for people to think about becoming more conscious of themselves in taking care of themselves.
I think a lot of that is about the voice and the gentleness of the voice, and you know, it's it's ideas, but it's also how you suggest those ideas. So that's nice. I didn't know. I'm rather touched you'd read any of my books. I mean, we must move on to doctors because I'm keeping an eye on the time. But I just on last sort of this deep dive on emotions and thoughts, and do you think do you go for the classic CBT idea that thoughts come first and then emotions? So I think I'm going to lose my job and then I feel sad. Well, how does what because I know that's the sort of one sort of model it's that way around. We think and then we feel.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that is going to happen, but I also think emotions happen. I mean, I suppose it depends how conscious it is as thought, isn't it? But, you know, we're so easily, to use that word, we're so easily triggered in so many different ways, whether it's we burn the toast, or we're listening to Ukraine on the radio, or just all the different myriad number of different ways in which our moods are affected by the environment we're in.
So you mean it's an emotion can flare, not necessarily because of the thought process, just because of some life experience almost? Or...
Yeah, just our kind of, you know, the senses and how they respond to something.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I feel it is a bit oversimplistic, just you think and then you feel. I mean, I think we all know that experience of like emotions kind of just overtaking us.
I mean, I think it's useful to dig a bit deeper into what the thoughts are and understand a bit more what's driving the thought. What was it? What was the fear? What was the anxiety? What was the disappointment? What is the context in which it's all come together in this moment? Whether the partnership or the family or friendships or work, you know, all the different streams that are sort of affecting how we feel in ourselves. So I think it's useful to use your thoughts to kind of center yourself as to why you're feeling in the way that you are.
Yeah, I think also I quite like the CBT work around the sort of 12 different classic negative ways of thinking, and you know, you can sort of, I'm going to move my chair a little bit because it's sun is moving around. You know, you can just become more and more self-aware of how they're playing out. You know, I mean, I've got really, really good at watching my own catastrophizing, for example, and just you know, it just happens so quickly, and I'm so good at it. I've been doing it for so long, but just knowing that that's what's going on is just really helpful.
Yeah, and then the things to, when you're aware of that, the sort of self-help kind of suggestions that you've given, you know, about nutrition, about sleep, about exercise, it's easier to say it than to do it. And of course, if you're depressed or feeling low, it's quite a struggle to, in some ways, do those things.
Sure.
But very simple, you know, simple, just one step in front of, as you've sort of articulated, you know, just get recentering yourself. And from these things sound so cliche, but they're just so true. The small steps that gradually build up.
Yeah.
You know, I went for a 20-minute walk before talking with you, and being in a room with central heating and stuff, and just being out in the wind, it just changes your energy.
Yeah, I've become more and more interested in sort of psychic energies and how they kind of reflect, like when you're feeling generous hearted and positive, then your interactions tend to be much more positive. And equally, I'm trying this thing at the moment. If I'm worried about somebody, or I think the interaction is going to be difficult, I just really spend time thinking all the things I love about that person, what's great about them, you know, so trying to line up with what, you know, where they're the very best person, and then the interactions are so different as a result. I found that really helpful. Yeah, and I like, as you say, that thing of the small steps. I'm a big, as you know, I've written about that, but I never forget when I was really very ill, and you know, this feeling that one couldn't do anything, and I remember sharpening some pencils. So I think it was my husband or maybe one of the children said, you know, why don't you just settle down and sharpen the pencils? And I just sort of sat there, sort of, you know, with all the children's stuff, and just, you know, just felt so good to sharpen the pencils, and just, you know, watching the shavings drop off and the pointed pencil. And it, you know, there was an element of mindfulness as well, sort of, you know, just being in that moment, doing that small thing, and then letting everything else kind of, you know, all the normal worries were just sort of on hold, even for that small moment.
And the support around you.
No, I was really very, very, very lucky in that. But talking of support, a perfect seg.
Yes.
One of these days I will replace somebody on the Today Show. But yeah, so yes, talking of support, so this focus that you moved to of particularly supporting doctors, and I was reading on your website, so You OK Doc, which I do
Yeah.
recommend to all our listeners.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just this idea that 80% of doctors are going to face burnout.
Yeah.
And it's very
Yeah.
personal for me because our daughter is a fourth year medic. So
Yes.
yeah, just tell me a bit more about that. Why is it just so high?
I mean, the figures are astonishing, and seem baked into the culture of one way or another. The system works with that level of burnout, and just the culture uh, of that world. It's so interesting, the different the pride in what they're able to do, the sacrifice, the genuine empathy for people.
It sort of
The whole,
becomes competitive sacrifice almost.
it's a very competitive world. There's a lot of in the one of the things that we have done direct service for doctors was something called the huddle, which is still ongoing on a Wednesday evening for an hour, where any doctor from the country as a whole is welcome to join. There's a maximum of 12 people that can be in it at any one for that hour. But one of the things that I did it for a year and a half. I don't do it now. It's been taken up by one of our other therapists. How articulate doctors are. Doctors can really talk about their mental health and issues that are facing them. But they're all very individualistic. They're all very much individuals. UK nurse huddles that we started a few weeks ago, there's a much stronger sense of community, of being part of a team. I'm being a bit simplistic, but a stronger emotional sense of connection to the team. The doctors.
That's so interesting. So what, doctors aren't so good at supporting each other?
They are, but it is still very much that there is the competition. I don't. It's a healthy competition in some ways. It's not. There's always these things they're good and bad.
Yeah.
But it's striking the competitiveness. They're demanded themselves to better themselves, to
Right.
always go the extra mile.
And does it start with the sort of elite thing that not everyone get, 1 in 10 people get into medical school. So they sort of start right at the get-go with this kind of elite mentality.
Yeah. No, I think that's that's very much a part of it. And at the same time, the younger generations are talking more. We have ambassadors for the charity. One of the things that we're very keen to do is to create community. The basis of community is as attending to everybody's health mentally and emotionally. So we've got ambassadors who are out in the different hospitals, trusts, GPs, talking about mental health and emotional well-being. A lot of them are the younger age groups.
And how does it work on a practical level? I mean, is there a formality to these chats, or
the ones where the ambassadors are out there?
Yeah,
well,
or just in general?
Well, I mean, as we've all got to use now, is social media. So there's Instagram.
Right.
Ambassadors have their own Instagram channels, or I don't even know what the word is, their own profiles.
Sure.
So there's a lot of noise, positive noise, about emotional and mental health. And I mean, at core, I think the charity's been going for about 2.5 years now. Really, in many ways, it's literally there to further develop the conversation about mental health and emotional well-being in the medical world, because it's there, but it's not there. And just how we start to bring it much more, make it much more of the central part of doctors' training around emotional and mental health.
And what's that about? Is it that sort of mental health is still the poor relation? It still gets less funding. There's less mental health representation on NHS boards. In lots of ways, it's the kind of Cinderella of the service.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's we've done our own podcasts and our webinars over the last 2 years or so with some really good experts and specialists, and people are very clear that billions has been spent. The money has been there, but it's not really being focused in a way that's really made any difference. So people are moving more towards, well, it's the structure, it's middle or upper management leaders who really have to proactively make it part of the environments that people are in.
And is it very practical? Is it sort of not having such long hours, or some of that time devoted to psychological well-being? Or
well, yeah, I mean, again, you know, it's a very adrenaline-based work environment. You know, these people, the doctors, the nurses, they love their jobs. Not one of them says they hate their jobs. At the core of it, they might be disillusioned by the environment or the politics or the money or whatever, but you know, they love their roles. I forgot where I was going with that. Where was I going with that?
Just whether it's more of a sort of practical answer or whether it's a more conversational approach. You were saying that it's got to kind of be leadership led, that it's a lot about the top management as well.
That's right. All the different moving parts, and part of it's about the individual and their competitive spirit. Part of it, do we as a society need medical environments to hold all the tensions that we bring to them about life and death, about vulnerability, about sickness?
That's interesting. Because there's always those bits of data that often, you know, people are just going to their doctors because they're sad, because they're lonely, they want to chat. You know, maybe that isn't that, you know, that approach to our NHS is, you know, we need, as you were saying, you know, there's more focus on mental health in the workplace. You know, maybe that's where that element needs to go.
Yeah.
To take some of the pressure off, I suppose.
I mean, I see it as a win-win. If we as a country, as a society, attend to people working on our behalf for our health are also, you know, there's attention to their mental and emotional health. Not only are they going to be, you know,
they'll be better doctors.
Say again.
Well, they'll have happy lives, but they'll be better doctors.
Better doctors, both in themselves, but also for us as their patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the old sort of oxygen, put on your mask first before you attend to anybody else's. And Chris, I can't believe the time is absolutely whizzing. We're nearly coming towards an end. But what would you say, you know, as you know, we have a lot of trainee medics listen, we're part of King's College London. What would you say to a young doctor? You know, imagine, as it were, you're talking to my daughter, Catherine. What would your advice be, you know, knowing these high rates of burnout?
I think the first, not to panic, to network with organisations like UOK-Doc. Since the pandemic, there's been several charities that have come into being for providing mental, emotional kind of resources, services for doctors and medical practitioners.
I think there's one called Wingman. I think that maybe the airline people got together to support doctors and nurses.
Yes. Yeah. And Frontline 19, I think, that seems it's coming again. Anecdotally, is coming back that they're very, you know, they provide sort of online Zoom counselling, set number of sessions. See if there's well-being staff in the environments that they're in. Know that the conversation is, you know, I think part of it is to push back against the fear of being judged or stigmatized if you talk about these things. Get involved. If I mean, you know, for some people, you know, they've got a lot on their hands anyway doing their job, but you know, it will come in to just read, understand, learn more about it, connect with charities like UOK-Doc. We've got webinars and podcasts that look at things like burnout and PTSD and anxiety, and pods on sleeping and nutrition, and just use those resources. I mean, even though there's a lot of things that still need to be addressed and changed, I also feel very optimistic about it. It does feel like a lot. Partly the pandemic has created a lot of opportunities out of something awful to look again at particularly medical. I mean, it's extraordinary what they hold, the number of different things, both from other colleagues, the environment, the work itself, patients who sexually harass women. That's something that's really not started. A conversation needs to start about that.
Well, because of the level of trauma of the person engaging with that.
Well, the patients sexually objectify female staff.
Oh, right. Okay, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's there as, I think, as a really important issue to start discussing.
Okay.
But just generally, it feels like there's much more. It comes down to, it's okay to have a conversation about these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, I salute you and all the work you're doing, because it's fantastic. So we're called Inspire the Mind, and I normally sort of wrap up by just saying, is the one thing that sort of particularly inspires you, like before you get to your desk in the morning and you're going to see a whole set of clients or get going on You Okay Doc? What inspires you, keeps you going?
We've got 2 dogs.
Oh,
They're always there first thing in the morning, looking ecstatic.
oh,
You just can't. It's ridiculously effective, but they start
yeah.
the day well.
I couldn't agree more. That kind of unconditional love, it's kind of like,
Yeah,
get a dose of it and your day goes well.
yeah,
Our dog Sammy, he's sitting in the background.
yeah, yeah. Um,
That's lovely.
yeah. And then the walk to the station, like today, beautiful day.
Yeah, yeah. Walking on Sunshine,
Yeah, walking on sunshine.
one of my books. Thank you very much, Chris. It's really been very, very enlightening talking to you. I feel we could have chat on for a lot more. I was very drawn to psychotherapy myself. I did the foundation course at Regent's College, and
Yes,
I admire the work you do. And I didn't keep going because I felt it was a huge level of commitment, and I wasn't
yes.
able with small children. But maybe it's something I'll come back to. But meanwhile, luckily we've got people like you.
Lovely to speak with you.